You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio. So hi everyone and welcome back to another amazing episode of Changing Reality. So welcome one, welcome all. If this is your first time watching the show, where have you been all our lives? This is the place to be inspired. But anyway, this show is basically brought to you guys by WQHS Radio. It's a show that is very special to my heart because we literally try our best here to help change your reality at the very least. So Changing Reality is a show that features phenomenal people from all walks of life who are in essence changing their own reality. So we'll be hanging out through the show and interviewing social change makers, entrepreneurs, business owners, thought leaders, industry experts, to even artists, musicians, and inspiring individuals from all across the world. Many from the Penn campus, many who were not, but bringing together the experiences from across countries, across spaces, so that we can open up our minds to see what the world has to offer. And by hearing these inspiring stories on how others are changing the reality around them and changing the way that not only they live, but the way the people around them experience things, hopefully we'll be able to pick up little nuggets of wisdom from their journey so that we can apply them in our own paths towards greatness. And I wanted to do this show simply because I feel like there are a lot of people out there who do phenomenal things and make waves in the lives of others. And I'm super passionate about learning how people are using those skills that they have, using those little things about themselves to change the world in their own capacity. And I believe that as we share these stories out there, as more people hear it, just the wealth of experience will serve as a platform to springboard us and inspire us to live life a little differently. And to show you how much I believe in the power of stories, how much it's changed my own life personally, I actually personally founded and run a youth movement called Ascendance. So it started back in Malaysia, which is where I'm from. And today it's grown to collaborate with not just our Malaysian Ministry of Education, but MNCs, global nonprofits, and institutions from all across the world, across 28 different countries. And it provides an alternative education platform for any student out there who wants to change their reality. So we work with students from elementary all the way up to college through various sessions, programs, experiential learning activities, projects that help them discover their passion, learn about themselves and the world around them through hands-on experiences, and start their own careers while they're still in school that creates meaningful impact not just for themselves, but for those around them as well. And to date, we've worked with over 35,000 students in 970 communities and have incubated countless number of student-run projects, social enterprises, and much more run by students aged 8 to 25 years old. And the basis for all of that has been stories, has been kind people who are willing to take their time out to share with us what made a difference in their life, what were the ways that they actually excelled, and that has provided that springboard for our students. And I hope that this show, Changing Reality, is that same platform for you so that you, our audience, can also one day look back and say, I heard this person, I heard their story. It inspired me to live a little differently, gave me an idea, it clued me in, and that continuously hearing these experiences week after week put you in the right environment to excel in whatever it is that you're passionate about. So if you want more info on that, or if you have something that you want to talk about, you have a particular topic or session that you're passionate about, let us know in the comments and we'll try to take up as much of your feedback and try to take up as much as kind of like the stories you want to uncover as we can. So with that, today we have a very, very exciting episode for you guys. We have with us not only a student entrepreneur, athlete, and someone who has made huge contributions to the startup scene in another Ivy League, but we have someone who didn't actually think that he wanted to be an entrepreneur from the get-go. And yet he has made strides in the field, not just for himself, but for the entire student body at, as I said, another Ivy League, Yale. So today we are speaking to not only one of the founders of the Yale Startup Incubator, but also the current president of the Yale Entrepreneurship Society. So without further ado, let's bring Clark onto our virtual stage. So hi, Clark. How are you today?
Great. Thanks so much for having me on. Really, really excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you haven't been having a busy day. You do so many things that I think that we're really honored that you just took your time to actually spend with us on the show.
No, this is great. It's a little bit of almost kind of a reprieve. I myself am starting to lose track of what's going on day to day. So it's nice to have a minute just to kind of sit down and almost unwind.
Oh no, totally. And I think the pandemic has made kind of like my brain worse, where it's just scrambled all sense of time and space. So now
I
things
feel
just
that.
happen. Yeah, then it's just like things are just happening in life. I have no control over like when it happens. So I agree with that. But like, thank you so much for being on. I know that when we chatted the last time, one of the things that really, really inspired me is that not only are you someone who is so like who is actually an active member of the entrepreneurship space, is helping others really discover that, but you yourself didn't always start out as an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah, that's spot on. And it's funny, you never think it's going to happen to you until it does. And I guess if you don't mind, I could just sort of start, I guess, from the beginning.
Go ahead. Go
Great.
ahead. What do you
So
want to? Where does your story start?
yeah, good question. I think it really starts back in because back in high school, I was committed to go play baseball at Duke University, which was very exciting. Big time baseball program, and I showed up freshman year, and I realized Duke was an amazing place, great school, really intense baseball program, and I had this sort of concept of what my life was going to be like. Like every 18-year-old, you think you have it figured out. And spoiler alert, I didn't. I thought I was going to go to Duke for 4 years, play baseball, and then go to law school and just be like a corporate lawyer until I roll over dead. And that did not happen. I actually, through the pandemic and a bunch of unique baseball circumstances that I won't bore you with, basically, I did end up transferring to Yale. And sort of all through that process, it's crazy. It's like one piece just kind of fell into place after another. I just kind of got sucked into this startup with these two amazing, at the time they were seniors on the Duke baseball team, and I was just helping them do little stuff like the CEO. He's a brilliant guy, but he needed help with some of the grammar on some of our slide decks. Yes, little stuff like that. And as a history major, as somebody who loves to read and write, that was some value I could provide. Was just, hey, let me look through your slide decks, and all kind of correct all the punctuation, all the spelling, all that good stuff. And he really appreciated that. And sort of from there, we got closer, and it all became kind of a game of trying to add value in any way you can. And not to get on a pedestal here, but I do think that that's a great lesson that I wish I could go back and tell my younger self is whatever it takes, just find a way to create unique value as a member of a team, member of a community. But anyway, so from getting involved with that startup kind of during the pandemic, and while I transferred to Yale, I just got an email in my inbox from the Yale Entrepreneurial Society, and I was like, "Ooh, finally, my chance to join a club. I've never done this before. I want to go to college and join a club like everybody does. Great." And I submit my little Google application. I get on an interview with Brihu, who was at the time the president, and I'm nervous. My hands are sweaty. I've got my little headphones on for the Zoom, and I'm like trying to think on the spot and trying to act super casual, like, yeah, I'm totally an entrepreneur. I know exactly what's happening, even though that was far from the truth. But luckily, I was welcomed into the club, and I guess from there, just sort of the same story back at the startup. I tried to find ways to create unique value within Yes, and part of that was sort of building a network of founders within the community, and thus the incubator was born. And then from there, it was just kind of a natural progression to be co-presidents with Brihu this last fall. And since Brihu has gone to go launch his own startup, Fable, and they're crushing it, that sort of left me as president of Yes this spring. So far so good. I know that was a little convoluted, but that's basically how I got to where I am today.
No, amazing, amazing. And I feel like many people have this idea of entrepreneurship that you've got to be a certain like a certain, I don't know, posh, articulate person who can think numbers and think like the big picture, and you're just basically this perfect person. I definitely disappoint a lot of people when they meet me and say, "Oh, you're an entrepreneur." Not what I expected in a sense. For you, kind of like going in thinking that okay, I was going to be a lawyer, I'm going to play baseball, I'm going to be a history major. I don't know. Like, did you just pick like the furthest possible thing from like the stuff that you were working on and be like, I want to try that? But anyway, when you kind of like were starting to venture into this entrepreneur space, or at least in that early time when you were still reading slide decks and just helping out a friend, what was kind of like your frame of mind about entrepreneurship? And tell us a little bit more in depth about the story of you really going through that process and starting to get into entrepreneurship for yourself.
It's funny. I'm sure I'm not alone in the journey, but you really you deal with a certain amount of imposter syndrome, and how you cope with that is really important. And I kind of just leaned into the fake it till you make it. And it's like, I'm you kind of at first sort of uncomfortable, if you're interfacing with the board, or you're doing so much preparation just to not sound like an idiot, just to have some baseline of like, okay, maybe this guy knows what he's talking about. And I don't know if this answers your question, but there definitely is sort of a process of coming into your own and feeling comfortable with your position, feeling comfortable with yourself, and calling yourself an entrepreneur. And it comes with time, and it was not a super comfortable process. Like I said, there are ups and downs for sure. And I think one of the a rule that's as true as can be is there's always, somebody in the room knows more than you. Somebody in the room has a bigger check than you. It's very humbling to be in a community like this, because you're constantly reminded that there's another level to strive for.
No, no, very, very true. And like battling through that imposter syndrome, like at what point did you realize that, entrepreneurship is something that I want to focus on? Was there any particular turning point? Was it a gradual process? Or did you just one day say, I'm reading too much law and history that if I read another page, my brain will explode. I've got to do something different. What was the point that you decided to take a bet
I
on
think
entrepreneurship?
the beauty of it is I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I and I'll avoid going on a whole tangent here about sort of founder archetypes and whatnot, but um, I think that there is room in my life to follow sort of my love of history, and writing and all that, and also sort of go down the entrepreneurial rabbit hole. But to answer your question, I think there was a little bit of a flip. I guess it would have been spring 2021. So, kind of as the pandemic was going on, I flew down to Nashville where our offices were. And that, I feel like over those, I guess it was probably about 3 months down there, that spring, that was when I kind of feel like I made a transition from just kind of like, hey, team, I'm here to help out with a PowerPoint here and there, to like actually feeling like, having a position of leadership within a company and being able to make an impact. And that's when I sort of started to become more comfortable in my own skin. And that was also while the Yes incubator was kicking off, and realizing that it's not an exact science. You can bring in your own flavor. You don't have to be an econ major. And that, different people just like different flavors. I think that's the best way I can put it.
No, very cool, very cool. In fact, there was this article, I think that was by Yale Daily News, about you who actually took, I think, a break from your baseball semester or your baseball season last spring, and decided to focus on your startup as well. I know that there was this whole backdrop of the pandemic, which probably made everything terrible in the sports world. But tell us a little bit about that decision and about how that transition came for you.
Yeah. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and I think what it came down to was I had to really sit down and think, what do I want from my Yale experience? And the cancellation of the baseball season made that decision all the easier, because baseball was kind of out of the equation. And so I thought, okay, well, what would a semester at Yale look like this spring? I'd probably be sort of quarantined in my dorm for the majority of the semester. I would have less time to work on the startup. I would lose a baseball season. I'd lose a year of eligibility. Or, I had the luxury, which is a really fortunate thing, to be able to take that semester off, and then subsequently this fall, and earn back that extra baseball season, buy myself a whole nother ideally COVID free year at Yale, And then also, most importantly, be able to be in Nashville, be face to face with our CEO, get some real hands-on experience, interface with some investors. And that was honestly a really transformative, when I look back, just a transformative period of my life, was stepping into a position of relative leadership kind of out of nowhere. And for me, at least, I was still kind of fresh off of, I think back to my time at Duke and being in the locker room and just being a freshman. And I'm standing and I'm looking at a bunch of people that are 6 inches taller than me. They're all older than me. And it takes a while to shake that feeling of being a freshman. And I think that last year was a great time, and a great opportunity for me to sort of come into my own as a leader.
No, very cool. So you step on, like, let's resume back the story. You step into Nashville. You are now in this amazing leadership position at this startup, probably one of the first few ventures that you worked on. And tell us about how you basically, like, what was the first few things that you actually did right from the get go in that startup, and how did your role evolve, and what was some of the highlights in that like period of time that made you in a sense?
Yeah, and it's funny that you asked, because my position was chief of staff, which is startup, early stage startup code for made up title has to be a Swiss Army knife. There's no, like, it sounds glamorous. It's not. And I'm glad you asked, because it's like, well, what does a chief of staff do? I'm not sitting around, walking around with my clipboard, like
30 people in front of you.
right. That's not what it was. It was, at first it was a lot of sales. And that was, I think that sales is a really important, and everybody would agree, but obviously an important piece of any early stage startup. But I think that if you have the opportunity, if you're a sophomore in college or you're finishing your freshman year and you're looking for a summer internship, trying to go into sales for an early stage startup, I think is an awesome experience to really understand kind of how the ins and outs work. But anyway, funny little anecdote here. Our sales process evolved/devolved in such a beautiful way, which was, I worked with my CEO to concoct these super elaborate email campaigns, and like, okay, we're going to go on HubSpot and we're going to curate this email list, and we're going to, phase it and A/B testing. And our response rates were low, and we were like, all right, what's going on here? And it was like, okay, let's switch to personally emailing people. It's like, oh, well, that's too slow. And it's like, okay, let's message people on LinkedIn. Let's get our hands dirty here. And that was a little better. And they were like, okay, let's do this. So one of our co-founders is like a little bit of Graham Stinson. He's a little bit of a baseball celebrity and sort of especially the college sphere. And he's now with the Tampa Bay Rays. So I literally logged into his Twitter account and just started DMing college baseball coaches, which was at the time our market. So I, as a 19 whatever year old intern, I'm just like basically just sitting on the couch, just ripping DMs, 40, 50 DMs a night on Twitter. And that became our sales process. And it was awesome. And that was the best success rate we had. And so it wasn't logical. It wasn't what we had planned, but it was what worked. And then, as my role kind of evolved, something that was really rewarding was being sort of a mini team leader, and kind of, not to get too technical, but implementing some Scrum methodology was a fun little business 101 lesson for me to learn, and being able to lead small groups and sort of stick to a plan. That was really rewarding as well. And like I said, just to go back to the sales piece, I really can't recommend enough. If you have the opportunity while in college to get some sales experience at a startup, I think that's really important. But yeah, I think as my role evolved, and then towards the end, I think a lot of it became sort of just being the right-hand man for our CEO. So whatever that means, if that means, hey, Clark, I double booked a meeting. I can't take this. I need you to sit down with this coach and talk him through the product, or whatever that looks like. Just kind of sort of being at his service and whatever he needs help with.
No, I think that's amazing, and I especially love that story about sales, because I feel like many times we have this very high level ideas of like how sales should be in a startup, or how like things are going to plan out, and then at the end it's not the very complicated stuff. It's the most simplest things that you really have to, as you said, get your hands dirty, get on the ground, and do things kind of like like reach out from person to person. So I definitely think that was like a very powerful story. And I'm sure that you have a million other stories from your startup experiences on kind of like having to, as you said, devolve a process to actually make it work and to actually get the results out of it. What do you think was some of like or the hardest thing for you to do? Because some people would argue sales is tough. Some people would argue, I don't know, regular communication is tough, planning is hard. What was for you kind of like the most challenging thing that you faced, and how did you kind of like begin to start looking at it differently?
I honestly think one of the most challenging things for me, which is ultimately what made it so rewarding, was that sales process. Because yeah, I guess at this point I was 20 years old, and I'm on a call, and I look to my right, and I have our 24-year-old CEO, and then I'm on a call with a 45-year-old head coach of a Division I program, and I'm thinking to myself, man, like I hope I don't look like a kid, and then you start overcompensating, and your voice gets a little lower because you want to sound older, and it was just very uncomfortable for me at first, and the idea of kind of selling a product was very alien to me, because you do have to be able to push people's buttons, and it is sort of a tango and it's a dance. Um, but I really think that was probably the most uncomfortable piece. And then also, you have to be really familiar with the product. And we were working on a highly technical product, and knowing the ins and outs of that. And, to an extent, it's like, oh, well, this isn't my call to mess up. So, ultimately overcoming that sort of fear of like, I don't want to mess up this lead because, Eli's going to be pissed or whatever. And ultimately being able to take ownership over the product and the sales process. We're two sort of mountains to climb. But ultimately, like I said earlier, it was a really rewarding thing to sort of have that fear and conquer it.
No, very, very well said. And I think the other thing that you said really well was the ability to take ownership, because I feel something only really works when you take ownership of it, when you kind of like put that entrepreneurship mindset on drive, and you really start looking at it as your business or your thing that you're working on. And that's when
Right.
you start innovating, that's when you start iterating, and that's when you actually eventually start to get results. I also work with a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs who, before starting their own entrepreneurship career, go around and work in a lot of other startups to actually go and participate in things. And one of the things like I feel like they face is very similar to what you were saying, is that it's not their thing. So it's either maybe they're not too familiar with it, or they're afraid that they're going to mess up, or the project that they're having is just so much beyond anything that they've ever done, that the kind of like the responsibility itself is much more scarier than even just picking up the call and doing something. And many times I feel that fear itself is paralyzing, or that fear itself gets you to make the mistake. So even if you were doing fine, that kind of like puts a stick in the wheel, and ends up like being the main reason that people fail. And then that affects your confidence. That again has that negative vicious cycle that makes you feel like maybe this isn't for me. For you, in a sense, how did you go about kind of like overcoming that fear? And for any aspiring entrepreneur who may be in that same space as you were a while ago, what do you think you could like your advice would be for them to be able to step back and really push aside all of that imposter syndrome, that fear, the things that they're facing, and be able to take ownership in a sense?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, because, as you were talking about fear and how it can be paralyzing. I was thinking that there is the other side of the coin, which is that fear can really bias us towards action. So if you take on, and this is a beautiful startup lesson that you can kind of extrapolate to the rest of life, but if you take on incrementally increasing amounts of things that are frightening to you, they become almost more and more palatable. And I know that's kind of abstract and wishy-washy, but really what that looks like is increasing sort of that discomfort level at what you're just able to tolerate. So if the thought of doing doing a sales call with an actual potential qualified lead is terrifying, paralyzing, can't do it, then don't do it. Okay. Pull aside, maybe not your CEO if he doesn't have time, but pull aside a senior sales leader and say, hey, can you give me 15 minutes to work on my pitch? And if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, go and do it. Okay. Because, you don't need to take 5 steps ahead. Find a way to take 2 or 3 steps ahead at a time. And if it's something you can bite off and chew and digest, that's something that you should do. So really the preparation, I think, and finding ways um, to prepare yourself is ultimately the only thing that's going to make you comfortable. That being said, I want to put a big old asterisk on everything I just said, because I do think baptism by fire is sort of just part of the deal. And as much as it is awesome to have that kind of grace period to prepare and be, as I said, sort of incrementally more uncomfortable in a way that you can tolerate, I also think that there's huge value in just being thrown into the mix and having to figure it out, because those are not only are they valuable, they also make for the funniest stories.
No, I agree. I agree. I think the best start, one, not one, not the best, but one of the best startup advice I've ever gotten is set yourself on fire, and eventually you'll figure it out. In a sense, is that if you are in the momentum, and if you're not in the momentum, put yourself in there, and then you will naturally figure it out. There's no way that you won't figure it out at the end. So
Right.
very like, and I think that you at least made it a bit more palatable for people who are like already afraid of the fire. But I think that that's the first step in a sense. Tell us a little bit about now how you've kind of like transitioned into being the main person at Yale Entrepreneurship Society, who's running the show as the president, uh, like without a co-president. Very sad, and
Right.
probably a lot of work for you. How did you go from kind of like a regular student in the club to someone in a leadership role there? I know many people who are like, I'm going to try out for this club. I'm just going to sit there silently and look at what I can learn. How do you really start growing and kind of like building yourself through that network?
Yeah. So I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was to find somebody who's better than you, find somebody that you want to be like, and attach yourself to them. And that's effectively what I did with Brihu. I watched this guy operate and I thought, oh my goodness, I have never met anybody that works like this. He's the single highest functioning person I'd ever met. So I said, okay, without being so annoying that he kicks me to the curb, I am just going to try to weasel my way into every Zoom, every phone call, every FaceTime, everything I can with Brihu. I'm going to sort of work my way into the conversation. And I just started picking up all these little habits and sort of cadences that even today I catch myself sort of different shades of Brihu. And I really I mean all that to say um, the impact that the leader of an organization has extends beyond sort of the immediate decisions that you make. It's also the people that you're leading are influenced, and uh, college is still a formative time in your life. And I think that a lot of my leadership qualities I actually got from Brihu, even though it was only basically a year where I was sort of under his guidance. I learned from him every day. And I think that also gave me kind of the confidence to take over this position. But yeah, really just having the luxury of being surrounded by so many incredible leaders that all have different styles. But particularly Brihu, I think is really what propelled me into the president position.
No, I think that's the best advice anyone could ever give about entrepreneurship, because I feel like coming into entrepreneurship, there's so much gray area. There's so many things that personally I didn't know. I still don't know. And I feel like the best cheat code on the planet is literally just following people around who have done it before, who are, as you said, kind of like the person you want to be versus kind of like the person you are. And I think that so much of what I've learned and why I've able to do is because of that, and only that. In a sense, it's just
Yeah.
because you notice yourself kind of like mirroring the way they handle a meeting, or mirroring the way they kind of speak to a lead, and that eventually you evolve into your own style as you kind of like get that experience. So it's kind of like this combination of learning from people and going out there and trying things out, and that kind of like builds you as an entrepreneur, I feel. And I think that that's very, very good advice to give. Tell us a little bit about maybe some of your early stories in the entrepreneurship club, how you actually started getting involved, making sure you drop in for those right Zoom calls and all of that. Because I feel like one issue is that people, it's not that they don't know like who they want to learn from. It's just that everyone's kind of afraid to reach out, and they're just like, you know what, they're probably busy and things like that. How did you go about that in a sense?
That's great. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's another piece of advice. That was another piece of advice I wish I could give my younger self, and something that was a learning curve, is how to communicate with people that you want something from. And for me, I don't know if it's how I was raised or my high school experience or whatever it is, the thought of emailing somebody twice was like unfathomable. Like if I emailed somebody and they didn't respond, I'd be like, "Oh no, like they didn't want to hear from me." And my time with Brihu absolutely pounded that out of my head. I mean, we had email chains where he would CC me and we'd try to be getting some school of management professor and just meet with them to talk about yes or ask for a resource or whatever it is. And I mean, they're honestly, there was one thread that I remember where Brihu sent 4 emails. And I remember sitting there thinking like, no, you're not going to send another one. And he's like, yup. And sure enough, the professor responded, "Oh, hey, Brihu, sorry, I've been busy. My bad. Like, let's connect later this week." And I was like, no way. And getting over that hump to realize only one of two things can happen. Either they say, honestly, like, thanks for reaching out. I'm not interested, in which case, whatever, you didn't lose anything. Or they say, I'm so sorry. I meant to respond earlier, but I didn't. And so that kind of getting over that immediate communication hump and realizing that it's okay to DM people on LinkedIn. It's okay to email people 3 times, 4 times. That was really important. But as far as kind of the earlier days of Yes, it was a lot of trial and error. So the way that this startup incubator, which was still probably one of my best experiences in Yes, was I'm sitting around with Brihu, and I was on a 3-person call. It was me, Brihu, and Eli, the CEO of StatStack, the startup I worked with, and we're kicking around the idea of a startup club. And we're like, hey, what if we had just all the startups in the community from Yale, whatever. What if we just had a club? And then we were like, yeah. And then we thought, well, what is the club gonna do? Like, what's the value gonna be? And then we were like, okay, let's come back to it. And through some kind of iterating and ideating and talking with founders about what would actually be helpful, the startup incubator kind of came to fruition, and it actually evolved more into a community. So the resource that we were able, the resource and value that we were able to provide to our startups in the Yale community was actually just having them meet each other and hear about each other's startups, because that was entirely lacking from the ecosystem. And it's something that you take for granted, but having a startup can be a very isolating experience for any number of reasons. It's hard. You feel like you're venturing into unknown territory, hopefully, because nobody's done what you've done before. And you're oftentimes left wondering if you're the only person who's going through what you're going through. And it's hard, I think this is another tangent I'm going to try to avoid, but entrepreneurship is very much glorified, but it's not super sexy. A lot of it's just difficult and gritty and, doing the menial work that nobody else wants to do. But anyway, having being able to curate a community of a bunch of founders that are all kind of like-minded in the sense of going and changing the world in some aspect or another, providing that for them was ultimately our good to the community. So being able to put together Zoom calls where they'd be able to pitch to each other, to connect with alumni, to meet with investors, and just queue in all these different avenues and channels of the ecosystem and sort of funnel it through this one centralized location. That was really special, I think. And I met a ton of amazing founders. A ton of them are still friends today. So that was kind of what the early days of Yes Leadership looked like for me.
No, absolutely brilliant. And I think that idea itself of just having a community, you're right. It is like there's so much more that I feel like we can learn from each other than we can learn apart. And I feel like we grew up in school, which I will not go on a tangent on, where we learn to compete with each other, where we learn that there can only be one person who succeeds and all of that. But in the entrepreneurship world, that's actually not very true. Like, yeah, there is some like level of competition, but there is much more potential in collaboration, in learning from each other, in sharing resources, in tapping into the same experiences than there is if we go around competing over like over like who gets the best this, who gets the best resources. So I think you definitely like that's a huge value add I feel to the startup community. We should probably do something like that here in Penn. I'm like we have an entrepreneurship club, so definitely a good idea. One thing that like I feel like coming out from that is many people they want to do something for the people around them. They see a problem, and they think that, you know what, like in your case, there are lots of startups. How do we bring them together? How do we do something like that connects them? But they don't take that step into making it something actionable or something that actually forms or like solidifies into a solution. So it's just a lot of like, yes, this is fun, this would be cool, we have an idea, but I'm busy with, I don't know, finals, or I'm busy with my own work, or I'm busy with kind of like my current tasks in a sense. So it's like there's a bit of a disconnect between like the ideas they have and kind of like the will to push it through and make it into something actionable. For you, in a sense, what enabled you, or you and kind of like your team, your early leadership team, to be able to not just come up with that idea but push through it and eventually go to the stage of even getting investors, as you mentioned, getting people to come in and speak, getting the resources pulled in, because these are like easy things to look at in hindsight, but would require a lot of work in those initial stages to get it rolling.
So you said something earlier that I thought was funny that I think actually answers this question really well, which was, uh, if you're on fire, like you'll figure it out. And I think what we really did was we just made a bunch of egregious promises to hundreds of people. We said, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do it by this date. And then it was like, oh boy, we just emailed all these people saying we were going to do this. Like, no, now we have to go do it. So it was like, okay, this has to happen. Let's find a way. So the motivation was never lacking because I basically, we put ourselves in a really precarious spot, which was either execute or look like an idiot and, to everybody that you care about. So it's almost like we had no choice. But, I think the other piece there is, as far as setting it in action, was realizing how many people want to help. There was no shortage of folks who kind of said they got at that point by saying basically, hey, you're not the first person who's reached out to me about this. I want to see you actually go and do it. Right? Because there is so much talk of, I want to change the community. I want to go start this. I want to found this. But it's like, okay, now let's actually go and do it. And if you show me that you're committed to doing this, I will give you my time. I will give you my resources. But it's important, beyond indicating interest, to actually show that you've put in the time. And that goes back to the piece that I said earlier. It's one thing if I email a professor and it's, hey, I have this club that I think is cool. What do you think? They're probably not going to respond. But if I've emailed them 4 times, that's when they know that, like, okay, this kid's obsessed. All right, I just got to shut him up. Sure, have 15 minutes. And I think that was something that a lot of our, alumni and community members picked up on was that these kids were obsessed. We were obsessed and driven. And I don't know if it's because we had nothing else to do because of the pandemic, but it was like a truly captivating semester of like, I'm going to make this happen. I will move heaven and earth to make it happen, which is another sort of crucial startup piece, is that nobody's going to do it for you, right? You just have to want it.
No, very, very well said. Tell us a little bit about the impact that you guys have now in like looking at it as a whole, like the things that have come out of it, and how your leadership position looks like now, like, and the work that you do now in a sense.
So I think that answer has changed a lot over the course of the last 12 months. And one of the challenges that we ran into this fall was, how can we have impact without being able to have like a traditional community of folks gathering, having typical speaker events where we're able to cram in 50 people into a room. And so a lot of it came down to, and this fall was great, but I think it got more transactional than I would have hoped for. And I think some of our teammates would agree. It was more, all right, you sign up for this and like you'll increase your chances of getting an internship. And a lot of the feedback that we got was, great stuff. But at the end of the day, like, I came here to join a community of folks who have similar interests who I can learn from. And so a lot of what this semester and this spring and what we have planned is sort of revitalizing that community feeling that we had before. So, the function that we want to serve is, yes, we want to be a focal point for people who want to get an internship at a startup. Yes, we want to help people break into venture capital. We want to help people start and scale their ventures. But we also want to be a group where everybody is texting everybody, where people are showing up to like hear their friends talk about stuff that they're working on, that they're excited to work on. We want it to be peer driven. We don't want it to just be like, ancient folks talking at you. Okay. And that's something that I learned a lot from from Jonathan Pierre, who led the incubator with me last spring, and led the second iteration of the incubator this fall. Was peer driven mentorship is just invaluable. But I guess to answer your question about what my current leadership position looks like, I feel like I'm in a good spot where I have such high functioning team leaders, that a lot of it just kind of looks like more administrative stuff, kind of being the face of Yes in any capacity. And, forming partnerships with other organizations, putting on joint events, reaching out and interfacing with alumni who want to get involved. But, I think one of the best things that I ever heard from my CEO, Eli, was never be too good to take out the trash. And so I think that's a really important piece. Is a lot of my work still looks like sending nitty gritty emails and cleaning up the website and doing LinkedIn posts. There's no shortage of work to be done. And I think that a lot of leadership starts with being willing to prove that you're able to do the menial stuff. And from there, the people that you're supporting, they'll be able to draw some level of inspiration from that and do it themselves. But, honestly, I think I have an easy job, just because the people that are working within Yes are just doing such a fantastic job. And our team leaders are just, every day, they're so competent, they're so capable, and the future is bright.
Very, very, very well said. And you brought up so many points that I think we can all learn from. One thing that I just wanted to focus on, simply because I feel like such a good thing that people don't talk about, is kind of like that phase where things begin to cool down from the fire, and things run smoothly, in a sense. So there's no issues, nothing's wrong, but it's still not quite the thing that we wanted to do. And I feel like so many people get caught up in that phase where you mentioned things get a little bit transactional. They're like, things are within control, in a sense. That is something that I personally faced with my startup a while ago. That's something that I see a lot of people tend to fall into, where things are comfortable in a way, and there's no need to kind of like I don't know, run as fast as we ran in the beginning. There's no need to kind of like push as much as we did. But well, actually there is a need, but that's what will make kind of like a difference to go to the next level. But because we kind of like have fallen into this trap of comfort, of kind of like thinking that we've got everything under control, we don't end up doing that extra steps, to those extra things that we did in the beginning that actually brought us to this level. Like, for you, in a way, how did you begin? Like, you mentioned like you were listening a lot to the feedback of what people were saying, and you were like, okay, how do we kind of like, well, like implement, like solve what people are saying, and kind of like take this differently? How did you begin kind of like wrapping your head around that? Number one, accepting the feedback. And I feel like what many people tend to do is just brush it off, like, oh no, we can justify this in some way. How did you accept that feedback and kind of like start looking at how you can step out of kind of like that funk? Because I think it's such a good thing that it's kind of like the second phase after you like the set yourself on fire phase. This is kind of like the second hurdle that is very important.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about a student organization is that it's almost like a quasi startup. It's sort of the intersection between student life and a startup, which is exciting because it almost doesn't matter like what the organization is. It could be a consulting club, but it's still entrepreneurial in a sense. And something I'm really glad you bring that up, because something that we ran into last spring was Brihu and I would just spin each other up 1,000 miles an hour. Like, we need to do this, we need to do that. Like, we have infinite time. Like, let's take this thing to the moon. Let's explode it. Let's make it go crazy. We got to scale. And that was just a constant pressure that we felt, entirely self-imposed. Like there was no reason why we felt that. But it was like, okay, we have time on our hands. Let's make this thing as big and bad as it can be. But the element that we didn't take into account was a huge limitation that student organizations faces is sustainability. So it's one thing to have a crazy semester where you email 10 billion people and have the world's biggest, membership. But like at the end of the day, what matters is the continuity, which is, how can we pass this on and leave it in the hands of the future president better than when I found it? And what we found is that actually looks like turning back the dials 10, 15%. So instead of constantly focusing on how can we scale, make it bigger, actually shrinking, cutting some of the excess fat, and thinking about what do we really care about, what's important, and what will let this thing live forever. So it's exciting to grow an organization and it's exciting to be on fire. But I think it's also important to stay lukewarm. I think that there's something to be said for having something that doesn't feel like an unwieldy monster. And that's kind of what Yes grew to feel like this at points this fall. It's like, this is too big. I can't even wrap my head around it. So being able to scale it back a little bit, that forced us to take a look at what we really care about. And ultimately what that came down to was pretty simply put, basically innovation and community. And so that's really our emphasis for this spring. And startups are different, right? So with a startup, I think it is important to have your hair on fire, almost all the time. Otherwise, somebody's going to come take your lunch. But that's why a student organization is special, is that, you can't always be scaling because you will sort of reach those limitations.
No, I think very, very well said. And I think that there's a lot of value for people who run all kinds of organizations and not just student organizations when they're looking at kind of like making it sustainable and making it kind of like long lasting. I think you explained it really, really well. Tell me a little bit about what's next for you. Tell us what's your plans, what's your hopes and aspirations, and what's next for the amazing world and journey of Clark that we'll have to uncover in our next interview a couple of years down the road, I guess.
If I've learned anything, it's that a plan can only get you so far. I have some things in the works, and I'm sorry that I have to give you a politician's non-answer. But I think I'd be foolish to sit here and tell you that I'm going to do this, this, and this, because who knows? I've met some really amazing friends that I think I'd love to one day found a venture with here at Yale. And like I said, I'm sorry to give you such a non-answer, but I think that entrepreneurship is definitely in the future, and Yes has had an unlimited impact on the trajectory of my life. So, unfortunately, that's basically all I can give you at this moment. But
no, one of the best non-answers
yeah.
I've gotten. It has
Thank
some
you.
value in it, so I like it.
Beating around the bush.
Tell me also a bit about what, as we wind down the conversation in a sense, what do you think are the main few things that if you had to, I don't know, if you had 60 seconds to travel back in time and tell your past self something, what would be the main three things that you tell them, actionable advice?
So it's something that I alluded to earlier. The first piece would be find somebody that you want to be like and just attach yourselves to them. Pay attention to what they're doing. Take notes. The second, and this could be controversial, is cut out social media. And this is a whole can of worms. I know we're wrapping up, but I think
open it a little. We've got the time.
Just a little bit. I think that there's so much excess and so much noise that comes with social media, and there's a lot of great stuff, right? We use social media extensively for marketing. So there's plenty of good in it, and I'm not one of these people who's going to tell you that social media is evil. But I think that as a high schooler or as a young college kid, Like, you do not need to be spending an hour, 2 hours a day on Instagram. Like, it's just not making you a better person. So I think that's a roundabout way of my second piece of advice, was be highly intentional about what's going to get you to where you want to be and go and execute. And I find it hard to believe that social media will be a part of a piece of that puzzle. And I think thirdly, and this is kind of a tough one to articulate, but just because something is sucky or scary or hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. In fact, those things, those qualities are never a reason why you shouldn't do something. In fact, if something is difficult and something scares you, you should probably go do it. Within reason, asterisk, use your judgment. But I think it's really important to step outside your comfort zone. That really is the only way you're going to grow. And it's so easy just to kind of fade into the background and kind of be a spectator through life. But, at the end of the day, you're the one that has to, look yourself in the mirror. And I think it's important that we take risks. I think it's important that you utilize your time, especially as a young person, when sometimes the opportunity cost is a little lower, to go and do something that you otherwise probably wouldn't do. And so, third piece of advice, go and do something that scares you, that you think will make you a better person.
No, I really like all three of those. And I think, I don't know, I feel like every student entrepreneur should just watch this as kind of like a PSA before they embark on the adventure, or whenever it is, because you just gave like really, really hard hitting advice that I think addresses many of the issues that I faced as a student entrepreneur, that I've seen student entrepreneurs face, and that I can foresee some of them would be facing for at least some time to come. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I had so much fun talking to you, and I hope that you had fun talking to us as well.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Really appreciate it.
All right. How can we get in contact with Yes? How can we find out more about the work that you guys do, or follow up with you on the stuff that you're working on, and be your loyal fans for the rest of your entrepreneurship journey or your baseball career?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So yes@yale.org. That's YES at Yale.org. That's our website. We keep it mostly up to date. And then also, I think probably the best way to follow everything that's happening is the Yale Entrepreneurial Society on LinkedIn. That's where we post most of what's happening, a lot of events and whatnot. So that's probably the best way to keep tabs on what Yes is up to.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much once again for being on the show. To our audience, thank you for listening. If you liked today's episode, make sure you give us a little like. Make sure you tell us in the comments, share your love, so that we can convince Clark to come back as a speaker for another one of our events. But thank you all for watching, and I really do hope that you learned as much in your own journeys, and that you can take the stuff that we've been talking about and find a way that you can not only think about changing the world, but actually start working towards the ideas that I know are going to make a difference. So thank you guys for joining us today, and see you guys next time again every Thursday at 10 p.m. ET, and whatever time that is around the world. Till then.
You're listening to Changing Reality. Changing Reality, where we bend reality all across the world. Only on WQHS Radio.